And now, time for something really shocking. It's emerged that a German intelligence report has found an 80 to 95% probability that COVID-19 came from the Wuhan lab accident and was suppressed by German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Now, some of you may remember it wasn't long ago that the Wuhan lab leak theory was dismissed as misinformation. Indeed, some even claimed that it was racist, the favourite word for the elite class today, but now it is quite clearly the most likely source of the virus. I'm joined tonight by one of the very first people to shine a light on this scandal, Matt Ridley, who joins us down the line. And I must say he was one of the first voices on this, a courageous voice challenging the dominant consensus. So, Matt, what are we learning from this report?
Well, what we're learning is that the German intelligence, whatever they're called, agency, said pretty early on that they thought it was very likely that it was a lab leak. And they based that on some documents that they managed to lift out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, including dissertations, and the research that was going on there. Now, we don't know what those documents were, but they made that assessment pretty early on, and then they sat on it. They didn't share it with the Americans until very recently. They didn't share it with other intelligence agencies, as far as we can. And we've only found out about it because it was leaked to the Süddeutsche Zeitung and others. It's just yet another example of how difficult it has been to get intelligence agencies, journalists, politicians to face up to the fact that we are almost certainly dealing with an enormous industrial accident that killed north of 20 million people.
And what do you think this is telling us about the political authorities? I mean, there has been this suggestion that Angela Merkel perhaps suppressed this information. I mean, what's it telling us about how politicians are trying to control the supply of information to voters?
Well, I mean, I had a similar experience with trying to talk to British security agencies and saying, look, you have to take the lab leak seriously. It's not a conspiracy theory. The evidence is really quite strong now. It's getting stronger all the time. The evidence for the alternative is very weak. And they just weren't interested in listening. And there were three reasons, I think, for this reluctance. One was that some people didn't want to upset China. Some people said so explicitly. Two was that some people wanted it to be a cautionary tale about chopping down the rainforest and things, and it didn't suit them. And three was that quite a lot of people thought it would damage the reputation of scientists. Well, it would have done an awful lot less damage if they'd said, look, there's one rogue lab that's gone wrong here. The rest of science is fine. By the way, you said I was one of the first. I wasn't, actually. In the first couple of months, I was going around telling people, no, it probably isn't a lab leak, because I was conned by an article written by some scientists saying, here's the evidence it's not a lab leak. And I later found out that they didn't believe it themselves, even as they were writing that article. So it's really it's a very significant scandal, this, and it needs to be brought to light and investigated thoroughly, and I'm not confident it's going to happen. We're not quite there yet, but we're at the beyond reasonable doubt stage.
But there is something broader going on here, isn't there, in that what's often called conspiracy theory, we've seen it, for example, with two-tier justice in this country. Angela Rayner comes out and says, well, two-tier justice is a conspiracy theory. But actually, 6-7 months down the line, we then get evidence about sentencing guidelines which are clearly advocating two-tier justice. There's something here about ideas, theories, concepts that fly in the face of the elite consensus. And the political class, the expert class, just seems incapable of sort of accepting it and interrogating it and thinking about it critically. Yet at the same time, if something else happens that fits within that groupthink, for example, the claim that Brexit was caused by Russian misinformation, which we know wasn't true, but they embrace that uncritically. I mean, there's something here about knowledge and information, isn't there? There's a sort of deeper story.
Yes, there is. And just as an example of that, today, the BBC was very slow to carry this story until I tweeted about it and saying, why isn't the BBC carrying this story? They've been very quick to carry any story about there might have been a raccoon dog that was infected in that market, et cetera, et cetera. Something happened to the elite class in the middle of the last decade, sometime around Brexit and Trump's first election, and they said to themselves, we've got to stop being neutral. Not only that, we're going to weaponize this word disinformation. We're going to weaponize misinformation and conspiracy theory and things like that to shoot down ideas that we think are wrong and dangerous, whether they're true or not. That's no longer the criterion we mind about. Now, that's going quite far saying that, but I'm sorry, I have been gobsmacked by how one-sided the approach to the misinformation question has become, and how many things that were originally described as misinformation by the elite have actually turned out to be true.
Well, I'm always struck by Andrew Sullivan's comment, the moderate conservative columnist in America, who says we're living through the greatest radicalization of the elite class since the 1960s. In other words, they've gone off a cliff when it comes to many of these issues. But thank you to Lord Ridley for his time and thoughts on this compelling development.
The Times, and which bunker did this story come from, Nick?
Awesome. This is Germany buried spy report that COVID started in Wuhan labs. This is shocking stuff, although not really shocking in the sense of surprising, but in the sense of appalling. So there are investigations by some very German-sounding newspapers, and they found that...
Do it.
Give us a go. There's Zeit and...
Süddeutsche
Zeitung, yeah.
Süddeutsche, that's like the South German Zeitung Daily. South German Daily, I reckon that's it.
I see. He's been all around the world.
I don't know that. I might be wrong.
He's got mines. He's got mines there.
He's got estates in Germany.
So the shocking thing was, Merkel was briefed while still in office that there was a 80 to 95% chance that the laboratory...
And that's quite high.
That is high, Josh.
And I know my maths.
I know, it's not my expert area either. That's considered high. That the lab thesis was correct. So, apart from the fact it was just obvious to any human with a brain...
I was going to say, they buried, reports saying that gravity exists. And
I know, it's shocking. I know. Everyone's like, no, guys, it was a wet market, and that's less racist to say that Chinese people eat wet bats. It's like, that's so much worse than the Wuhan lab thing. Anyway... Yeah, incredibly, she kept them secret, and this is just—it's baffling. You look at what Sweden did; they didn't treat the people as idiots. They let them know the information. This kind of thing is backfiring so badly on the progressive elite, but it's so worrying because it's caused this legitimacy crisis because no one trusts governments anymore, right, across the West. So why do they do these kind of things? Just tell people it's from the lab.
But what's the benefit of saying it's not from a lab? If the science is saying, and we've got to trust the science, as we all know. If it's saying 95% chance, well, I mean,
that is exactly the question.
What's the benefit?
What was the upside of Germany bearing the report and just saying it came from Wuhan? Now, what it seems like it would be to me is it felt like the countries, it wasn't about racism, it was about countries coming around and going and protecting China somehow out of fear. That's what it felt like to me. Because otherwise, if at that time it was like, oh, it came from a lab in Wuhan, even though supposedly it was also funded by America and other places, the point is, then we would be angry at China as the government, and the people would demand some kind of reparations for death, for losing years of our life.
If it came from a wet market, people were still angry. I mean, Trump was going around calling it China.
No, but that's an accident, isn't it? If it's a deliberate thing. So now that this stuff is out there, when are we going to actually get some money back for the billions that we lost?
This doesn't say it's deliberate. It just says it came from a lab. So I still don't understand.
Well, it was made in a lab.
There is a Wuhan laboratory of coronaviruses. I don't know why anyone didn't go, hang on, Mike. Well, I think
Josh is right. It means people would want some sort of sanctions against China. It would also be more of a rabbit hole of what was Fauci doing there, what were Americans doing, gain of function research. It's a whole Pandora's box. Whereas if you just say, oh, it's a wet market, you don't have that.